will formally call it at this time. Case number 113267, Luke Gannon et al. Appellees v. State of Kansas Appellant. I'll ask counsel to rise and state your appearances for the record.
Alan Root, John Robb, and Jessica Sweats in for the plaintiff appellate.
Good morning, Your Honor. The state of Kansas appears to the Office of Attorney General Derek Schmidt, Toby Kraus, Solicitor General.
Are there any preliminary matters to take up as far as counsel is concerned before we proceed?
Not from appellate.
No, Your Honor.
Very well, counsel, you may proceed.
I was admonished to remind you the court of Toby Kraus. I'd like to reserve 4 minutes on behalf of the state of Kansas.
4 minutes is granted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, I have 2 points to make to the court this morning. First is that SB 16 substantially complies with this court's directive in Gannon 6. And second, because it does, this court should dismiss the case. Reserving those 4 minutes, I'd like to move to my first point. And that is that SB 16 substantially complies with this court's command in Gannon 16, or in Gannon 6. As this court remembers, I was here last spring indicating what the legislative package that we have before you presented over $1 billion of new money to the school finance system. There was an implication of Montoy plus inflation. We talked a lot about what the inflation metric was. This court issued an opinion saying that it largely agreed with the process that the legislature enacted, but there were 2 problems with it. First is that there is a principal of $522 million that this court indicated was not appropriately inflated, and so that needed to be inflated for 2 years, and then once that new principal amount was properly inflated, it needed to account for inflation going forward until the end of 2023. Following this court's directive in that regard, the Deputy Secretary of Education, Mr. Dale Dennis, calculated what that amount was, presented it in July of 2018 to the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education approved that amount. The amounts that were calculated were placed into the base, and that was proposed through legislation. Separately, the new governor calculated the amount of money that her budget people indicated that they thought would need to be associated to comply with this court's directive in Gannon 6. Those amounts were about $6 million off, and so the governor, it's my understanding, got behind the State Board of Education's directive, and that legislation was presented to the court. Or to the
Let me ask you this.
Sure.
Last year, we didn't, the state did, coined the phrase Montoy Safe Harbor, and we threw that around. Is Senate Bill 16 the Montoy Safe Harbor?
Senate Bill 16 was calculated to satisfy this court's commands in Gannon 6, which was
and I'm wondering if those are different, and what I'm trying to probe is whether the 2 things are different. So what's your definition, the state's definition of the Montoy Safe Harbor?
Well, I think the state has taken this court at its words as to what Montoy plus inflation was in Gannon 6.
I want to take out the last court decision.
Okay.
Because the Montoy Safe Harbor was a creation of the legislature, an idea. Let's go do this. And as I remember it, the safe harbor was, we're going to pick a point, because we can't do it all at once, we're going to pick a point in time when we are going to supply the funding that would have been supplied by the old Montoy formula. Now, am I right that that's what we were doing?
Yeah, I think that's how we came to the number of $522 million as the payoff period. And my recollection, having watched the argument yesterday, is you and I had a long discussion as to what that $522 million was. And so that's what this court indicated in, I think it's page 25, is that principal amount of $522 million was lacking 2 years of inflation of roughly $99 million.
And I'm trying to set aside the court opinion for a second, and I'm just trying to play within the definitions that we got last legislative session when the legislature came up with, we'll do this in order to remedy the lawsuit.
Sure.
So when Dale Dennis produced the inflation adjustment number, where he took the 1.4% average inflation rate and took it out to the 22-23 school year, does that represent the Montoy safe harbor?
Well, I think what Mr. Dennis would say, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think what he would say is that using the chart that I think was on page 24 of this court's opinion, he tried to replicate that out going to 2023, and then he subtracted the amount of money that would be needed to get to that.
And I don't care about the subtractions
Sure.
yet. I just care about the gross number. And so what he did was the same thing legislative research did, was stick in, from last year, they took the 2010, 2011 prior amount, took the inflation percentage of 3.22% for that particular year, got an inflation adjustment, and then totaled it and added it up in the right-hand column, and did that all the way through the 22-23 school year, eventually getting to $3.7 billion by the 22-23 school year. I'm trying to figure out is, setting aside what this court said last year, is this the Montoy safe harbor that the legislature conceived of last year?
I don't believe so, and it's because of that. So before I get there, I think it's 1.44 is what the calculation was.
Well,
but
I was going on the 2010, 2011. That was the first year of the legislative research calculation.
Okay.
And then you sort of took, and then you dropped off, and
Yeah.
we had what we had. But then Dennis took the legislative research numbers and then added for the future years 1.44% as the average. But the bottom line is, by the 2022-23 school year, he's at a net, what he calls the net amount of $3.7 billion. And I realize you've got to subtract out of it what has happened in the past, with the legislation that's happened in the past. But I'm just trying to figure out, is $3.7 billion worth of spending in the 22-23 school year the Montoy safe harbor?
I don't think so, and it's because of the $522 million that you and I talked about last year's. The legislature had calculated what it would cost to get to the Montoy safe harbor of $522 million. And that's why I know you don't want to talk about what this court said, but what this court talked about was 2 years of inflation needed to be added to that $522 million. And so my understanding of Montoy safe harbor is informed by this court's decision in Gannon 6 of adding the 2 years of inflation, which is, I think, $99 million to get to $621 million. And then, as this court said on page 25, then you need to inflate that $621 million over the amount. What Mr. Dennis did is a different calculation, and I will grant you in our brief, I think we've identified it, in addition to Mr. Dennis's math and the plaintiff's math, I think there are at least 5 different calculations as to what this court may have meant, but it all gets back to the $522 million amount inflated. And so that's why I think the 522 is the safe harbor that answers your direct questions.
So cutting to the quick, taking this chart that the Department of Education put together that has a net amount in that last school year, $3.7 billion, the state's position is that is not the Montoy safe harbor.
Yeah, I don't think that was the target when we were here last spring.
I'm sure it wasn't the target when we were here last spring, but that's
Right.
because you guys didn't calculate it right. But
What is it then?
Yeah,
What is the 3 points? What was its purpose in being determined?
So I think, as Mr. Dennis indicated to the legislature, and my understanding is what the legislature calculated is they assumed, they read this court's decision and looked at it as what would it take to get Montoy all the way to 2023, subtract what is already in the system, and that amount I think is $363 million. And Mr. Dennis said, okay,
Well, what would it take to get Montoy to 2023?
I think that's what the plaintiff's position is
No,
that,
on the chart. This is state's appendix at page 27. That chart, the last number in the bottom right is 3,742,611,889, and that is taking the number from 2010, 2011, and applying an inflation adjustment each year, and applying it to the new total, which looks to me like it's taking the Montoy approved amount and inflating it year by year by year by year to get to 2023. And so why isn't that what Montoy numbers would have been in 2023? That's what we're asking. Why that methodology is intended to take Montoy's approved numbers, move them through with inflation, and get to a total, and why isn't that what we're talking about?
well, for a couple of reasons. First is I think Mr. Dennis took that number, subtracted what.
No. We're talking about if we didn't have any numbers, if we didn't have Gannon, if we had Montoy and had taken it forward with inflation. If we never had Gannon, what would that number have been? And that's what that chart says to me, is if we hadn't had Gannon at all, we just took Montoy and the legislature had carried it through with cost of living adjustments every year, inflation adjustments, they would have gotten to 3.7 billion, right?
Well,
Isn't that what this chart says?
So I'll push back just a little bit, because I think that if you ignored everything that had occurred between Montoy and today, then the formulas don't match up. We were talking last spring about how the new, I'll call the Gannon formula, was better and more concentrated and more directed than what Montoy was. What is included within the calculations of Montoy are different than what's included in the legislative package that's before this court. And so it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison.
So you're not arguing for a Montoy safe harbor?
No, I think our position last spring is consistent with our position this spring, and that is Montoy safe harbor is what we came to last year as we talked about the $522 million difference. Now, as this court indicated, in substance and structure and implementation, it substantially complies, subject to that $522 million being inflated. And so our position then, as it is today, is that the legislative package before this court is not only more directed to the school needs of the Kansas school children, it provides better money to where it's needed the most, and it is a better package on a holistic approach. So
to use the words I think that you just used, is 3.742 the inflated number of 522 or for the Montoy in 2023? I think that was how you said it, was what would be the inflated number of Montoy in 2023, and is that the 3.7?
Well, I think the answer is what the difference is. Is that what you're looking for?
No, just what is the Montoy base? What would be?
I think
the
Mr. Dennis
Montoy-
calculated it at 3.7.
Okay, so that is our target number.
No, that's
before
not our.
subtraction.
Yeah, that's not our. Well,
Under the Montoy safe harbor, if we're looking at
that was the first step of Mr. Dennis's calculation, is to calculate out to 3.7. Then he subtracted the funding that was in the system, which is roughly, I forget what the math is. The resulting figure is $363 million, that there's a deficiency of $363 million. Mr. Dennis calculated that. He calculated the amount, spread it over 4 years, and put it into the base. In addition to that, as we've talked about before, there are virtual school aid, LOB funding, CAPERS, and various other targeting amounts that go into that figure. But our target is $363 million.
And if you do the math backwards and add the numbers that we have, do we get to 3.742 million?
Well, I think it depends on what we add in there. I don't think that the figure ever gets to 3.7 on added basis. But as Mr. Dennis indicated, complying with this court's decision in Gannon 6, that's not what this court said. That's not what the legislature.
And I think all of our questions at this point are trying to set aside what Gannon 6 might have said.
Well, but
and
I'll
just say,
take.
are we at Montoy Safe Harbor today?
Yeah,
And it sounds like you're saying we're not.
I'll take a little bit of issue with, I don't think we can ignore what this court said in Gannon 6 because the legislature received this court's order and it attempted to comply with it.
And I don't know that we're
Mis-
arguing that, but conceptually for us to grasp the concepts, it helps us to kind of put those in silos.
Yeah,
And so we're
I,
just trying to do that at this point.
I would answer directly that I don't think we get to 3.7, and I don't think we were attempting to get to 3.7. I think what the legislature, what the State Board of Education, Mr. Dennis, the legislature, and the governor all were attempting to do is to satisfy this court's language in Gannon 6 as it was explained, and that number is $363 million, and that has been appropriated. It's put into the base. The base information, as we put forth, raises the base by 6.5% the first year, and over 1.6% more than the rate of inflation going forward. And then we get to the end of the phase-in period in which there's a 3-year rolling average of inflation. So it's the state's position that we have satisfied the Montoy Safe Harbor from Gannon 6. And to blame the state for not hitting a different target it's just a different conversation.
And so I take it you disagree with the plaintiff's calculation that what you're really doing in those final years is 0.36% inflation.
Well, we take issue with blaming us for not hitting a target that we didn't intend to strike. And, there are, as we indicated, there are at least 5 different ways in which we could calculate compliance with Gannon 6. We set those forth in the brief. We think that Mr. Dennis's calculation or I should say the State Board of Education's calculation is the correct one. Bipartisan majorities of both chambers agreed. The governor signed it, and I think both the State Board of Education and the governor asked for an opportunity to submit their briefs in support of that bill that is before you, because that's what was calculated and that's what was determined responsive to this court's command. So that's whether or not we hit different metrics and different targets that weren't intended, to me, is an irrelevant question, because at the end of the day, we're attempting to satisfy this court's definition of what constitutional compliance was, and Article 6, Section 6B indicates no particular amount of funding. I think this court, as far back as USD 229, said that suitable provision for funding isn't reducible to a numeric value. And finally, the legislature has to be given an appropriate amount of discretion in how it implements the funding mechanism as directed by this court. So for those reasons, we think that the legislature has satisfied, and the governor and the State Board of Education wholeheartedly agree.
In your mind, what is substantial compliance? I mean, other states have grappled with this. It seems like other states and Kansas, even back with Montoy, reached this point where we're kind of close, or maybe we're exceed or don't exceed, but we're close. What is substantial compliance? Even if we use the $3.7 billion figure, if we're 93% the way there, is that substantial compliance?
Well,
If we use that figure, how do you define, or how would you understand it?
I think this court's cases indicate that there is no numeric value as to what substantial compliance is. I think what this court, while we've talked about the 522 and inflation, what this court said is that the state, through structure and particularly implementation, has made advancements to substantial compliance. And we think that's the kind of the touchstone of what this court's inquiry is, as to whether or not the funding mechanism that's currently before the court, which is substantially similar to what this court indicated in, I think it was 2006 in Montoy 4, that's what we have before this court. That's what we understood this court to say, 522, inflate it for 2 years, add the inflation going forward. Mr. Dennis got there in a different way that gets to the 3.7 and brings that question into play But what the legislature did is they satisfied what the State Board of Education, who's, after all, I think it's Article 6, Section 2, responsible to supervise education. That's what the State Board of Education believes is necessary, not only to comply with this court's decisions, but also what would meet the needs of the Kansas school system. And so by any different metric, it just becomes a math question, and whether or not we have to hit a particular math calculation. As I indicated, just with this on Gannon 6, I think we can get to 5, 6, maybe 7 different ways to calculate what compliance with that would look like. But at the end of the day, I think the unanimous support of the State Board of Education, the legislature, and the governor is a strong indication that we've satisfied us, as well as what this court said last in Gannon 6 about the structure and implementation. So I think that's about as direct as I can answer your question.
Is there a way you can tie Senate Bill 16 back to the district court's rulings to give us a factual foundation for upholding it as being reasonably calculated to meet the Rose standards? I mean, let me tell you what I tried
Sure.
to do this weekend was I looked at the remedy that the district court had put in place in 2013. How time flies. And that was to put in place a base state aid per pupil of $44.95, and then the weightings are different. And I understand all that, but what I tried to do was anchor what the legislature has accomplished with the factual findings of the district court, because in the end, we're bound by those factual findings. Have you been able to do something like that?
No is the answer, and I think there are a couple of reasons why. Is the formulas have changed so much, what is included and what isn't. I think the virtual state aid is a perfect example as to was it included initially, is it included now? The weightings are different. And so the best information we have is that what the State Board of Education has suggested with regard to the base calculations as to what is appropriate and what is consistent with the Montoy Safe Harbor and Gannon 6. And so I think that's while 4492 I think was at play in the district court level, so many years have gone by, the formulas have changed, the theory of education has changed. I mean, we're still stuck in the 1992 world of the SQFPAA, but it has changed enough that I'm not sure that there is a direct analog that we can tie it to the district court. What I would say is simply that the State Board of Education and Mr. Dennis is comfortable with the base that's in place with SB 16. And as I mentioned, it hits inflation at 6.5%, I believe, in the first year and 3% thereafter. As a result, we put in our reply brief that there is a significant increase in teacher salaries where they're no longer struggling. I think surrounding states, we are the highest. So I think by a whole variety of metrics that this court could look at, we are substantially complying with the Constitution. And I think that's what this court said in Gannon 6, is that through structure and implementation, we have done so. Tying it to a factual finding of the district court, I've not attempted to do so, and I'm not aware of how you would do it otherwise.
Let's move you over to your second point, and I've got to tell you, I don't have a lot of sympathy for the idea of dismissing this lawsuit, and part of it may be based on the fact that 13 or 14 or 15 years ago, I stood in exactly the same spot you're standing right now, probably on the same carpet, and made the same argument. And the legislature reneged on the deal. And so here's my concern. If we were to dismiss this lawsuit now, and next year the legislature went back and put in that block grant program that we've already said was structurally unconstitutional, the law of this case would prevent that law from getting into being implemented. And all the plaintiffs would have to do is come here, and if we dismiss it, they've got to go back to district court. They have the burden of proof, and we're off to the races, when what the legislature did is something we've already said they can't do. And that seems to be wrong. So that's my problem.
Sure.
So how are you going to get me past that?
All right. So what I would say to you is I understand your concerns. I get it. But there are a couple of countervailing factors that I think the court needs to be aware of. First is separation of powers. This court has made its ruling, but the legislature and the governor have separate and co-equal opportunities and responsibilities to the educational community. If this court retains jurisdiction, that legislative process going back and forth with the stakeholders of the educational community are at some level thwarted.
The problem I have with that argument is that you're not in compliance until you get to the end of the years on this deal. And so it's kind of like a desegregation case where you've got to achieve a certain goal before you're in compliance. And until you get into compliance, it seems to me it's fair for the court to at least hold the case in abeyance to make sure you do what you promised, that future legislatures do what this legislature has created a non-binding promise that will happen in the future. I don't see separation of powers causing a problem when you're in an unconstitutional condition, which you are until assuming we approve this, till you get to where you say you're going to get.
Sure. So again, I understand if that's the court's position. I get it. It makes sense. But what I'm telling you is that the innovation of educational systems are being frustrated because if a school district goes to the legislature and says, hey, there's a disruptive technology, a new way we want to teach, what we want to do is change the educational system just a bit. Well, that legislature has to receive the information and say, yeah, it's a great idea, but maybe that creates adequacy issues. Maybe that creates equity issues. Oh, I don't know.
Wouldn't it want to go through that analysis anyway, even if this lawsuit were not pending?
So it would and it does, but not at the point of a bayonet of any violation would find non-constitutional compliance such that school closing could be the option. And so allowing the legislature the deference and the measure to make those changes, I think, is important. If this court wants to retain jurisdiction, I think there are ways in which it could do that. I don't think it's the right thing for...
What's the middle ground then? If I'm on one side of the continuum and you're on the other,
Right.
Where do we meet?
So I think there is a way in which this court could retain jurisdiction subject only to if they change the system from what the current law is, that would be something this court could look at. But for example, if through the passage of time a plaintiff believes, well, it really doesn't give us as much money as we thought we would, we'd like you to add more money to it. There needs to be a separation between complying with what the law is today and being a sounding board for different complaints that the plaintiffs have. I think the opening brief of the plaintiffs in this case is a perfect example. I forget what the new complaint that they had was called, but something that wasn't even brought up in Gannon 6, they're complaining about in this litigation. And the legislature just can't be bombarded using this court as the lever for changing educational policy, which is what the state's fear of retaining jurisdiction would look like. So if it's just subject to, making sure that the legislature has fully funded, given this court's history with the Montoy and the block grants, I understand. As the state's advocate, I disagree with it, but I understand. And so I'm not sure that's the middle ground that you're looking for, but that's one I've got.
No, I'm not sure I wasn't talking about the same thing you're talking about now as an accommodation. I am somewhat concerned, though, about the 1.4% or 1.44% inflation figure. It seems like it would be to the benefit of both sides that if that went up or down, that somebody might want to raise their hand and say, we're not getting to the end here. And
So if I could push back on that
sure.
just a little bit. I don't know that either the State Board of Education and certainly the legislature don't believe that 1.44 A is appropriate, B that CPI is appropriate, and C that that's a constitutional obligation to keep that. So I'm not sure that we would want to lever up on an inflation mechanism.
The legislature's the one that picked the CPI, though. We didn't put that in here.
Well, I think that's what, the 1.44 comes from Gannon 6 that the legislature accepted. I think there are schools of thought that the CPI is an improper metric. I don't think that if you're looking at a basket of consumer goods, I think that's different than operating schools. I think the contained marketplace, there's an economic argument for why CPI as a strict measure of inflation doesn't correlate necessarily to schools. And so I'm not sure that I would want to have plaintiffs given the opportunity to come over here and say inflation went up or it went down.
But the index that the legislature originally chose and put in the law, and has at the back end of this
Right.
deal, that number can still go up and down. That index.
The back end number can go up and down, but I'm saying as an order, if I understood you correctly, an order of this court would be 1.44 is the base, because we're going to get into fights as to what the proper metric is and how we look at that. Do we look at a 3-year rolling average? Do we look at the CPI Midwest? I mean, there are a whole host of problems that I foresee with that. So,
Well,
I think we understood that to be the state's proposal for Montoy Safe Harbor, though. That's why we adopted it.
1.4.
Well, no, just that to use the Midwest CPI is consistent with what the legislation did at the back end.
Well, so different things. I think at the back end, that has already been put into law. The legislature has accepted that. I'm not, as the state's advocate who would like to make sure that the legislature is given the appropriate amount of policy-making authority in order to change that. I think those are different inquiries. And again, we had the discussion last spring as to whether or not a measure of inflation is a constitutionally required aspect.
Well, and that's not the point. The point is that you've got to, if you're going to land in the Montoy Safe Harbor, you have to get to the Montoy Safe Harbor number. And
I think that's what our position is. The $363 million figure does. That complies with what this court said in Gannon 6. It is tied to the $522 million.
And in your view, that can't change over the next few years based upon what inflation does between now and 2023.
The law in place gets us to 2023. That's correct. And any change or alteration to that restarts the legislative process, which this court is, I'm certain, familiar with. That brings a whole host of different things into the legislative process. And so now that the law is passed, I think this court said through structure and implementation, the law last spring was on its way, subject to that minor inflation issue that we were talking about. And so that's what the legislature took this court at its word, fixed that. It's got, the State Board of Education has done it, even in the face of plaintiffs changing positions of, hey, you did your math wrong. The State Board went back, reconsidered, and said, no, we didn't. We adhere to this. The legislature relied upon that recommendation, and the governor signed it into law. So we don't think that requiring the legislature to change the law that it has already passed is an appropriate result.
We're in an interesting place when $360 million is considered a minor shortfall.
Well, I'm not suggesting 363 million. I was here last spring talking about how 50 million was constitutionally insignificant. I think what the legislature has done is it's taken this court at its word and calculated that. So it's certainly, whatever you want to categorize 363 million as, it's not a billion. And that's what plaintiff's math would lead to. And so that's why I think it's an important calculation. You're looking at me like you don't know.
No, I'm trying to understand. I'm just trying to follow you.
So I think what the legislature has done is it has relied upon this court's direction in Gannon 6, complied with it, and that's where we are. Because of the constitutional compliance, it's the state's position. Dismissal, for the reasons I've indicated, is a more appropriate remedy.
let me clarify.
Sure.
After 2023, the legislation that's in place now provides that each year thereafter, based on the consumer price index, there will be an amount added to the education budget representing inflation.
My recollection is it's a a backwards-looking 3-year rolling average.
Well, inflation
Yes.
will be added
Yes.
every year after 2023, and it will be added to the total amount of the last year's budget.
I believe that's correct.
Just
Your Honor.
like your appendix, page 27 was. You add the inflation, and next year you add the inflation, and next year you add the inflation.
I think there are that's two different inquiries, but yeah, my understanding of the package that was before this court last year is that there is a 3-year rolling average at the end that will be added in. Yes.
Every year, inflation will be added.
Going forward from 2023, yes.
Right. And now you're asking us, or you're saying that you only owe inflation on the amount of shortfall that you propose to pay in installments. That 522 was the shortfall, constitutional shortfall, correct?
I think at page 25, that's what this court said, is there's the principal amount was calculated
It's real
incorrectly.
simple. The 522 was a constitutional shortfall that you proposed to pay in installments rather than immediately.
I think that's correct.
And what you're saying is that you only have to pay inflation on the shortfall, not on the rest of the budget.
Well, I'm not sure that that's what I'm saying. I think that's what this court said on page 25, is that 522 needs to be inflated for 2 years to add 99 million, and then that amount, the next sentence in that bottom paragraph on the slip opinion, page 25, says that amount then needs to be inflated toward the end. So yeah.
And does that make any sense that you're not going to pay you're not going to cure the unconstitutionality immediately? You're going to do that in installments, and because you're doing that in installments, you don't owe inflation on anything other than your shortfall until 2023, after which you'll adjust for inflation every year.
Well, I think that's what this court did in Montoy 4 is it spread over the catch-up payments over a period. I think in Montoy 4 it was 3 years. In what we had last spring was 4 years, and so I think it is consistent with this court's practice that we carry it forward, and that's what this, I hate to keep coming back to page 25, but Mr. Dennis has pounded that in my brains here, is that page 25, that's what this court said, is we pay that amount over. And so I think that's consistent with Montoy 4 and Gannon 6.
We have any further questions? Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honors.
May it please the court, Alan Rook for the appellees. I'd like to do a reset for just a moment. We are in the remedial phase. This lawsuit started in 2010, and we have proven our case at trial. We have a court order as far as the trial court's concerned with what needs to happen with an unconstitutional system. And we are now, hopefully, nearing a point where there is complete compliance. We have and are thankful for the $93 million that the legislature added this year. They have, in fact, satisfied inflation for this year. And as you see, when we ask for a remedy, we're asking to look forward, tell them what they need to do to be in compliance or even substantial compliance, and let the legislature convene next session to accomplish that.
Well, you're resetting here. Why don't you reset to a few months ago when you met with the legislature and a representative of your group acknowledged twice that you agreed with these calculations and that they would satisfy the Montoy Safe Harbor. Not once, but twice. And wasn't there some reliance on that representation to move this legislation forward based upon your representation that it's satisfied and you were not going to contest it? And you did that twice. We have a doctrine we often apply called invited error. Why isn't that kind of an invited error kind of area? It's not quite applicable, but why? Tell me why that isn't. What changed your mind?
I would agree it's not applicable, but the error was when the basis and how the error was made.
Wasn't
we
that
don't know.
explained to you right at the outset?
We took the word of the State Department of Education as to setting the bases, and when we did the math on those bases, reaching the target of 3.7, it didn't come out. And because of that, we re-looked at our position. If there's any reliance that was going on here, it was the organization that we work for relying on the State Department of Education telling us that the target was 3.7, setting the basis accordingly, and then we did the math. And it was as a result of a comment by a senator about leaving money on the table that caused us to back up and look to see if the math worked. It didn't. We retracted our position before this matter was ever voted on, and before it ever became law. So in terms of your notion that doctrine of invited error doesn't fit here, I agree with that. But luckily, we made, for the sake of the kids of Kansas, we did the math correctly and backed up on our position. With regard to the reset, in the remedial phase, this is the state's burden. And I think we've learned considerable about the state's position from Mr. Krause's remarks. And I won't take long to answer the question, is 3.7 the target? The answer to that is yes. 3.7 is not only the target, it is the target that the state set. And the state relied on the Senate Bill 61's reliance on the CPU, or CPI-U, and set the inflation rate at 1.44.
Let me tell you the problem I'm having with that. And I agree, there's a little bit of shifting going along here. But last year, the legislature said, hey, way to get rid of this lawsuit is we're just going to do the Montoy safe harbor and go back. But that safe harbor number, that 3.7 billion by that school year, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the minimum level necessary to comply with the Constitution. And that's why I've had this fixation of going back to the district court ruling, which is the only place where we've got any facts to deal with. I mean, it's perfectly acceptable for the legislature to say, we're going to use the Montoy safe harbor and try to be done with this thing. But that could be here, and the minimum constitutional level could be here, below that, which to me means that the target for the Montoy safe harbor doesn't have to equal constitutional compliance.
That's the reset with regard to the state having the burden of proof, us prevailing at trial. The trial court determined what amounts were necessary or determined that the system was not adequate based on the money that had been allotted for school funding at that time. And that's the amount that Appendix 9 at 27 outlines. That's what the Kurt Tiedemann memo that was before you in Gannon 6 did up through.
I don't think that's true. I really don't. I think that's just, no one's saying that Montoy, the formula in Montoy, was the bare minimum constitutional level. No one's ever said that. I think there is an indication from the trial court findings that if you did it, you would be at or above, but it's not the floor. And so why isn't it proper for the legislature to come in at a lower number as long as it's reasonably calculated to meet the Rose standards?
But that wasn't the proof at trial. The proof at trial was not that a lower number would work. The proof at trial was that the money they were spending at the time wasn't sufficient to reach adequacy under Article 6.
But we're
Section
spending a whole bunch more than that now,
Well,
from where you were at trial.
Well, I agree there's additional funding, but it's not reaching the target. And they computed, it's a local.
But you're equating the target to the Constitution, and I don't think you can do that. Or I don't understand why you think that. The target can be above the Constitution, and they can just decide they don't want to meet the target as long as they're meeting the Constitution.
It was your guidance in Gannon 6 that suggested what they needed to do with their notion of this safe harbor. What they needed to do was to provide for inflation in the out years.
And so if we find that what they did complies with the Gannon 6 order, we're done.
But it doesn't comply.
Well, but if we found that, I mean, if the way we read it and if we determined that the way Dale Dennis and these other educational organizations and the legislature have looked at Gannon 6, if we decide they looked at it properly, then we ought to be done, right?
I don't think so,
Okay, why not?
because you don't meet the Rose factors with what they've done.
How do we know that?
Because they have the burden to show you. In the last 30 minutes, you heard counsel say that he couldn't link those. And without the link to the Rose factors, their constitutional argument fails. And with the notion of them being in substantial compliance by falling $363 million or $270 million short, that is not substantial compliance. That's 5,400 teachers with regard to the $720 million number. With regard to the deficiency, $270 million number is what they're off. That's 5,400 teachers. They can't get to the Rose factors with the system that they currently have. When Tiedemann provided the information before Gannon 6 and accounted for the expenditures through 2016 or 17, he got to 3.4. And that's when this court suggested compute the inflation in the out years. And that's what Dale Dennis did. And he came up with the number 3.742. That's what he figured. And he did it based on Senate Bill 61's reliance on the CPI.
And your position is that they're 271 million short, right?
Yes.
Which is 93%, which is only 7% of the 3.7.
Which is, in the world of education, when there aren't sufficient funds, and when that kind of deficiency would purchase 5,400 teachers to accomplish the Rose factors, I would say that that is not close.
Yeah, I asked Mr. Kraus the same thing. What is substantial compliance? 7% off 7%, 3% have to be right on target because we're not sure if that's it. Articulate for me what you think substantial compliance is.
Maybe I can start by answering what it's not. It's not substantial compliance when we continue to leave a quarter of the kids behind. To get to substantial...
That's not where we're at. I'm talking about the funding that will get us to the Montoy safe harbor, at least according to your calculations. How close to the $3.7 billion does it have to be? And that's in 22, 23. If they were off $100,000, would that not get you there? Where are we at?
That would be easy. $100,000 off would be easy.
Okay, that's easy. What isn't easy?
$270 million is not substantial compliance.
So it's kind of you know it if you see it.
Yeah, well, to some extent, that's correct. But we know it's not substantial compliance because they can't link that deficiency to an accomplishment of the Rose factors. And that's what their burden is in this court at this time. We are in the remedial phase.
Mr. Root, Mr. Krause kept talking about the idea of, well, we basically did what we said to do in Gannon 6. Could you comment on that or expand on that argument?
Sure. When I heard Mr. Krause explain that, I thought of a loaf of bread. If you look at Plaintiff's Appendix 9, and you look at what was spent in 2010, 2011, what 3.2 billion is, let's say, is the cost of a loaf of bread. That cost, that loaf of bread in 2010, in 2022-23, is going to cost 3.7 billion. That's the inflation that occurs. What Mr. Krause in this page 25 defense has done is parsed this court's word enlarged, and as indicated in a question just a few minutes ago, focused on the increase. You don't figure the inflation on a loaf of bread by taking one slice and figuring the inflation on that slice. It's on the whole loaf of bread. So with regard to Mr. Krause's comment, it is a creative argument, but it doesn't solve the problem because the way he describes it, it doesn't work the way inflation works. Inflation is on the entire loaf of bread.
The decrease of purchasing power or buying power.
Yes. So his argument does not get to the purchasing power from the difference between 2010 and 2023 by focusing on one slice in that loaf of bread.
But are the two problems we identified in that opinion crystal clear in that regard? It seems to me that one could read it both ways. That we're talking about the failure to adjust 2 years of funding for inflation result in a higher amount of principal, more than the 522 million the memo calculates. And then the second problem, the failure to adjust for inflation until the memo's calculated principal sum, parent 522 million plus the adjustment in paragraph 1, is paid in approximately 5 years. And I understand one of the arguments is that the inflation figures were to be applied to that, the shortfall principal sum, that we're calling principal sum, as if it were an installment contract on the constitutional makeup. Well, tell me why this language is clear that the inflation applies to the whole budget rather than the shortfall.
Well, I look at it pretty simply. It's a question of what's the problem and what's the solution. And your guidance was identifying what the problem was and what the solution is. And if the solution is to parse, it doesn't solve the problem. If the problem is going to be solved and we reach the target, it's going to be necessary to apply inflation to the entire loaf of bread. That's my point. And that solves the problem, at least, and I should remind this court, we never thought the Montoy Safe Harbor reached a point of adequacy. If you look at all the studies that have been done that are in the record in this case, clear up through Dr. Taylor, the numbers that are needed to reach the notion of adequacy are substantially more than what we've been talking about in terms of the safe harbor. And with regard to that safe harbor, even if you accept that amount, parsing one loaf of bread or just applying the increase on the inflationary amount doesn't get you there. So in terms of what did this court mean? This court meant here are some parameters for solving the problem. The problem doesn't get solved with that, what I call the page 25 defense. The second graders, when the cuts began, are graduating this year, at least most of it. The 25% who were deprived of their right to a constitutionally equitable and adequate education are casualties of the process. And I think we have to remember that as we look at the remedy that should be fashioned in Gannon 7. And we ask this court to maintain jurisdiction. We ask the court to accept and thank the legislature for the 1 year of inflation they have resolved. And we ask the court to instruct the legislature on what they need to do to get there. And in terms of the target, it is a target that they set that by council's own admission, they have not achieved. And we ask that you give the legislature direction so that no more years go by that let those Kansas school children fall behind.
Mr. Roop, I've heard you say that before numerous times, and I've been thinking about this over the preparing for this maybe the last phase of this case. I've been on this court 14 years, and 11 of those 14 years, there's been ongoing school finance litigation. First 2 years of Montoy, and then approximately 8 or 9 years of this case. Is there ever crossing the finish line in these types of cases? Or are you going to be back here 3 or 4 years down the road making the same argument you just made? The future of our children, they're casualties of the process. Is this just indefinite?
I don't think so.
Well, tell me why, because you're a veteran of this. I think I'm becoming one. Where does this ever end?
I will tell you this. John Robb called me in May of 1989 and said, do you want to sue the state of Kansas over how they distribute public education money? I have been at this since that early period of time, along with others in this room. At this moment, right now, looking at what the legislature did in the last session and the bipartisan action by the legislature, I think we're getting real close, because I think if this court gives the legislature and the governor and the State Board of Education the path to that 3.7 that they set as the target, that we get there. And if you look at the evidence in the case, and particularly the evidence of the increase in achievement following the injection for 2 years of money in Montoy, I think we're going to get there.
I guess the problem is that, as I see it, is that compliance, constitutional compliance, seems to be attached to or tethered to whatever the issues are of the present case. And then 2 or 3 years from now, it could be something else. And it seems to be, as opposed to an ongoing kind of phenomena that you're in compliance, it's at a fixed place in time. And I guess the time here is either 2019 or 2022, and we're projecting down the road. That's part of the phenomena that's frustrating here. Is the compliance seems to be fixed, but it really is a moving type of target.
Well, as long as we have a constitution, and as long as we have unconstitutional action, there will always be the tension over compliance. And school funding isn't any different than any other constitutional issue. And maybe the difference is the tenacity of the plaintiffs. But I'll tell you.
No, I think it is different. I think it's a different constitutional concept. You in some cases you can fix it and it's done. In this, it's a constant changing phenomena as education's credentials and tests change and the way you measure things change. It seems to be just an ongoing kind of phenomena that we're dealing with here.
Well, I would hope we never got to a point that we didn't provide Kansas school children a suitable education, and we're not doing it now. And if that takes another lawsuit in 2024 because the legislature has backed up on something and this court has dismissed the case, then I hope I'm at the podium then, because I think the kids of Kansas are worth it.
Mr. Roop, let's bring us back to the case at hand. You agree, even on your calculations, that the state did, the legislature did provide for inflation. You complain that it's 0.36% rather than 1.44, correct?
Well, that's when you look at their numbers spread over the installments, yes.
Would you agree that when you look at the numbers that we have before us, that it includes an effective rate of inflation of 0.36% per year?
We point that out in our brief. yes.
Okay, so we do have inflation here. It's not 1.44, but what's 1.44? 1.44 is an average. Not tied to anything. It was just a number that was thrown out. So my bottom line question is, why is the 0.36% inflation rate unconstitutional? Why does that undermine the structure and implementation reasonably designed to reach the Rose factor?
It's implementation, it's not structure. It doesn't
Right.
get to their target of 3.7. It is not based on the CPIU Midwest that Senate Bill 61 says should be relied on. And it doesn't, I guess my third point's my first point, it doesn't get them to the target. That's why it's unacceptable.
So why is the target back? I think my colleague asked this probably 30 minutes ago. Why is the 3.7 billion target the minimum, the floor for constitutionality?
Because that's what the state computed would get them to the Montoy Safe Harbor. And they don't get there. They're $270 million short.
But what the state computed, or what you might agree to, or what the legislature might agree to, has nothing to do with the task at hand.
Well, that's
because parties can't agree to constitutionality. I mean, bottom line is we have to interpret the Constitution, and I'm trying to get from you and from Mr. Kraus is how we relate all these numbers back to our task at hand, whether the implementation meets our test.
Yeah, we're in the remedy phase. They have the burden to show that the system that they have devised achieves those Rose factors, and they can't do it. And they sure can't do it when they set their own target number. They do the computation. They have a statute that provides for relying on the CPIU Midwest. They don't follow that. The logic of 0.36 that you've talked about could apply at 0.0001%. I guess if they do anything under that rationale, they have satisfied the position in their minds. But they have to get to the safe harbor. And at 3.7 with an interest rate of 0.36, you don't get there, would be my response.
That takes me back to a question I think it was Justice Biles asked, and it started with, in this litigation, the state hired an expert witness, and that expert witness came in with a figure to reach constitutional compliance of even more than the Montoy Safe Harbor, correct?
Yes,
And the state decided not to use that and went the Montoy Safe Harbor route.
that's correct. Back to the Future, 2006.
But as I think Justice Biles was indicating, who has said that the Montoy Safe Harbor is the floor for constitutional compliance?
Well, I think the state of Kansas is the one that made that argument that was accepted by this court, that the safe harbor was something that if they go back to 2006, this court didn't declare it unconstitutional at that time or constitutional. It was just there, and moved that money forward to 2023, that would constitute compliance. And they haven't done that. And it's nowhere close to where the studies that the state has funded and got guidance from. It's not even close to those amounts.
I think there have been some references in briefs over the last several years which alleges that you and your colleagues and your clients basically want to sit as a super legislature. Taking that argument at face value, if we agree with you and you say, accept the $93 million and thank the legislature for that for the first year, and send this back and tell them what they need to do to be compliant, sitting as the super legislator, tell us with specificity what they need to do.
The numbers are in our brief, so I won't recite the numbers, but they need to reset the basis to get to 3.7 by 2023. It's that simple. They need to go back and figure those bases that has a trajectory of 3.4 by 2023, reset those so that we achieve the Montoy Safe Harbor in 2023. Or they could go back and pay all the inflation up front right away. Either way.
And what amount would that be?
It's in our brief, but the amount of money would be the 363 or close to that number paid now.
Does that conclude your presentation?
It does.
Any more questions? Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honors. I have 3 points to make. First is the legislation that you have before you commits over $1 billion. The State Board of Education says that that isn't sufficient to comply with the Constitution. Second, when I was before you last spring, this court said that the legislation before you last spring largely complied. Third, the only thing before this court currently is whether or not the state has properly calculated inflation. Again, the State Board of Education has repeatedly agreed that the amount of funding provided by this legislation satisfies that inflation figure. Large bipartisan majorities of the legislature have agreed. The governor has signed off. Everyone agrees that this is what satisfies not only the Constitution, but also the best interest of the children. And as I began my presentation last spring, I said the constitutional language is the alpha and omega. Has the legislature made suitable provision for the finance of public education? All of the stakeholders before this court agree that the state has done so. If there are no further questions, I'll stand.
When you talked about the legislation currently before this court and the amount of money that it provides, are you referring only to SB 16?
I think the entire package, including what we talked about last spring as well as this court. So
SB 19, SB 423, SB 61.
yes, as well as SB 16 in front of the court this year. Yes, Your Honor.
Does that conclude your presentation?
It does. Thank you, Your Honor.
Any more questions? All right, thank you, counsel. We thank both counsel for your arguments this morning. Court will take this matter under advisement.